The spring of 1875 brought change to the Esperanza Valley in South Texas, and with it came trouble that threatened to tear apart a community that had lived in harmony for generations. Don Alejandro Vasquez could feel it in the wind as he rode his black stallion, Sombra, across the rolling grasslands that his family had called home for over a century. At 52, Alejandro was still the finest vaquero in 3 counties, a man whose skill with a rope had become the stuff of legend. They said he could lasso a hummingbird without ruffling its feathers, rope a Mustang from a quarter-mile away, and perform tricks with his riata that seemed to defy the laws of physics. But more than his legendary abilities, it was his wisdom, dignity, and generous spirit that had made him a respected leader in the valley. The Vasquez family had received their land grant from the Spanish Crown in 1767, and through Mexican independence, the Texas Revolution, and the Mexican-American War, they had managed to hold on to their ancestral home through a combination of legal savvy, political connections, and the respect they'd earned from neighbors of all backgrounds. The Rancho Esperanza stretched across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, supporting not just the Vasquez family, but dozens of vaquero families who had worked the land for generations. But now that peaceful existence was under threat. A consortium of Eastern investors, led by a ruthless land speculator named Cornelius Blackwood, had arrived in the valley with lawyers, surveyors, and a small army of hired guns. They claimed that the old Spanish and Mexican land grants were invalid under American law, and they were systematically challenging the ownership of every ranch in the valley. "It's not just about the land," Alejandro told his son Miguel, as they watched a group of Blackwood's men surveying the eastern pastures. "It's about erasing our history, our culture, our way of life. They want to turn this valley into something it was never meant to be." Miguel, 25 years old and every bit as skilled a horseman as his father, gripped his reins tightly. "Then we fight them, Papa. We have the law on our side. Our land grants are legitimate, recorded in 3 different governments. The law is only as strong as the men who enforce it," Alejandro replied sadly. "And Blackwood has bought himself a judge, a sheriff, and half the county commissioners. We need something more than legal documents to win this fight." The crisis came to a head on a hot June morning when Blackwood's men arrived at the ranch with an eviction notice, claiming that a recent court ruling had invalidated the Vasquez land grant. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a weak man who'd been bought and paid for by Eastern money, stood uncomfortably beside Blackwood's lawyer as he read the legal document. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises," announced the lawyer, a thin man named Silas Crane who wore his corruption like an expensive suit. "Any livestock, buildings, or improvements will be considered property of the Esperanza Valley Development Company." Alejandro sat calmly on Sombra, his weathered hands resting on his saddle horn, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the scene. Around him, 3 generations of vaqueros had gathered, men, women, and children, whose families had worked this land since before Texas was even a republic. "Senor Crane," Alejandro said in perfect English, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "I have here the original land grant, signed by the Viceroy of New Spain in 1767. I have the confirmation from the Mexican government in 1824. I have the treaty guarantees from the Republic of Texas in 1836, and the federal confirmation from the United States government in 1848. Which of these documents do you claim is invalid?" Crane's face flushed red. "All of them, if the court says they are. American law doesn't recognize foreign land grants that can't be properly surveyed and documented according to modern standards." "And who determines these modern standards?" asked a new voice. Everyone turned to see Judge William Harrison approaching on horseback, flanked by 2 federal marshals. Harrison was one of the few honest officials left in the county, a man who'd built his reputation on fairness and adherence to the law. Sheriff Bradley went pale. "Judge Harrison, I wasn't expecting." "I'm sure you weren't, Tom," Harrison said dryly. "Mr. Crane, I've been reviewing the case files, and I'm afraid there are some serious irregularities in the proceedings. The court order you're attempting to execute was issued without proper notice to the defendants, without allowing them to present their evidence, and by a judge who has a documented financial interest in the outcome. Crane sputtered indignantly. "Judge Harrison, you have no jurisdiction." "I have federal jurisdiction over all matters involving treaty obligations and constitutional rights," Harrison interrupted. "And I'm issuing a temporary restraining order against any further action by the Esperanza Valley Development Company until this matter can be properly adjudicated." Blackwood himself stepped forward, a large man with cold eyes and the kind of smile that never reached them. "Judge, you're making a mistake. These people are squatters on American soil. They have no legal right to be here." "These people," Harrison replied firmly, "are American citizens whose property rights are guaranteed by treaty, by law, and by the Constitution, and anyone who attempts to violate those rights will answer to federal authority." As the legal confrontation played out, Alejandro noticed something that troubled him more than the immediate threat to his land. The community was beginning to fracture along ethnic lines. Some of the Anglo settlers who had moved into the valley in recent years were siding with Blackwood, believing his promises of development and prosperity. Meanwhile, the Mexican-American families were drawing together defensively, suspicious of their newer neighbors. That evening, as Alejandro sat on the porch of his adobe ranch house, his wife Elena joined him with 2 cups of coffee and the wisdom that had guided their family through 4 decades of marriage. "You're thinking about more than just the land," she observed, settling into the chair beside him. "The land we can fight for in court," Alejandro replied. "But what about the community? What about the trust and friendship that took generations to build? Blackwood isn't just trying to steal our property, he's trying to divide us against each other." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps it's time to remind everyone what we have in common instead of what separates us." The idea came to Alejandro that night as he lay awake listening to the sounds of the ranch, the gentle lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the mesquite trees, the distant call of a coyote. The next morning, he rode into the town of Esperanza and posted notices in both English and Spanish announcing a grand rodeo and fiesta to be held in 2 weeks' time. "A celebration?" Miguel asked when his father explained the plan. "Papa, we're fighting for our lives here. This isn't the time for parties." "This is exactly the time," Alejandro replied. "When people are afraid and angry, they forget what they share and remember only what divides them. We need to remind them of the bonds that unite this community." The announcement caused a sensation throughout the valley. Some people were excited by the prospect of the first major celebration in years. Others were skeptical, wondering how anyone could think of festivities when the community was under siege. But Alejandro had calculated correctly. The promise of competition, entertainment, and prizes was too tempting for most people to resist. Blackwood, of course, saw the rodeo as an opportunity to further his own agenda. He announced that his company would sponsor several events and offer substantial cash prizes, clearly hoping to buy influence and support. He also brought in professional cowboys from as far away as Kansas and Colorado, men whose skills were legendary, but whose loyalties were purely mercenary. "Let them come," Alejandro told his vaqueros as they prepared for the competition. "We'll show them what real horsemanship looks like." The day of the rodeo dawned clear and hot, with a crowd that included people from across South Texas and northern Mexico. The makeshift arena had been set up in a natural amphitheater on the Vasquez Ranch, with wooden bleachers borrowed from 3 different towns and colorful banners fluttering in the breeze. The early events, bronc riding, steer wrestling, and calf roping, showcased the skills that were essential to ranch life. The competition was fierce, with Blackwood's hired professionals winning several events through sheer athleticism and experience. But the crowd's enthusiasm was reserved for the local competitors, especially the vaqueros whose style and grace set them apart from the more utilitarian approach of the visiting cowboys. The turning point came during the trick roping competition, an event that Alejandro had specifically requested be added to the program. This wasn't just about practical skills, it was about artistry, creativity, and the kind of mastery that came from a lifetime of dedication to the craft. One by one, the competitors took their turns in the arena. The professional cowboys performed competently, executing standard tricks with mechanical precision. But when the local vaqueros began their demonstrations, the crowd fell silent in appreciation of what they were witnessing. Young Carlos Mendoza, barely 18 years old, performed a routine that involved 3 ropes simultaneously, creating patterns in the air that looked like living sculptures. Maria Gonzalez, one of the few women competitors, demonstrated techniques that her grandmother had learned from Apache raiders, incorporating dance-like movements that told stories through rope and motion. But everyone was waiting for Alejandro. The master vaquero had not competed in public for over 10 years, preferring to let younger men take the spotlight. But today was different. Today, he was fighting for more than prizes or recognition. He was fighting for the soul of his community. When Alejandro entered the arena, the crowd rose to its feet in spontaneous applause. He rode Sombra to the center of the ring, dismounted with fluid grace, and began his performance with a simple loop that grew larger and larger until it encompassed nearly the entire arena. What followed was 20 minutes of pure artistry. Alejandro's riata seemed to come alive in his hands, forming shapes and patterns that defied belief. He roped fence posts from impossible angles, caught multiple targets simultaneously, and performed tricks that had been passed down through generations of vaquero masters. But the climax of his performance was something no one had ever seen before. Alejandro called for volunteers from the audience, not just Mexican Americans, but Anglos, Germans, and even some of Blackwood's men. One by one, he incorporated them into his routine, using his rope to create a living mandala of people from different backgrounds, all connected by the same loop of braided rawhide. "This is what we are," he called out to the crowd as he manipulated the rope to bring the volunteers closer together. Different people, different backgrounds, but all part of the same community, all connected by the same land, the same dreams, the same hopes for our children. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Alejandro wasn't finished. He called Blackwood himself into the arena, challenging him to a contest that would settle their dispute once and for all. "You claim to understand this land better than we do," Alejandro said, his voice carrying clearly across the arena. "You say our ways are outdated, that we don't belong in the modern world. Very well. Prove it. Show us that your methods are superior to ours." Blackwood, trapped by his own arrogance and the expectations of the crowd, agreed to the challenge. The contest was simple. Each man would attempt to rope and gentle a wild Mustang that had been brought in from the desert. Whoever succeeded first would be declared the winner. The Mustang was a magnificent animal, a paint stallion with fire in his eyes and rebellion in every line of his body. He had never felt a rope or known the touch of human hands, and he made his feelings about captivity abundantly clear. Blackwood went first, using the brutal methods that were common among professional horsebreakers. He roped the Mustang with brute force, wrestled him to the ground, and attempted to break his spirit through dominance and intimidation. The crowd watched in uncomfortable silence as man and horse battled in a contest that seemed to have no winners. After an hour of struggle, Blackwood managed to get a saddle on the Mustang, and even rode him for a few minutes before being thrown violently to the ground. The horse stood trembling and defeated, his spirit broken but not truly tamed. Then it was Alejandro's turn. The master vaquero approached the Mustang with patience and respect, speaking to him in the soft Spanish that horses seem to understand instinctively. Instead of forcing a confrontation, he allowed the animal to become accustomed to his presence, his scent, his voice. The crowd watched in fascination as Alejandro began to work with the Mustang, not against him. He used his rope not as a weapon of domination, but as a tool of communication, gently guiding the horse through a series of movements that gradually built trust between them. It took 3 hours, but eventually, Alejandro was able to slip a halter over the Mustang's head, then a blanket, then a saddle. When he finally mounted the horse, there was no bucking, no fighting, just a magnificent animal and a master horseman moving together in perfect harmony. The crowd's reaction was thunderous, but more important than the applause was what Alejandro saw in their faces. The artificial divisions that Blackwood had tried to exploit were forgotten in the face of something that transcended culture and language. The recognition of true mastery, genuine wisdom, and the kind of leadership that inspired rather than intimidated. Judge Harrison, who had been watching from the stands, stood up and addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've seen something remarkable here today. We've seen the difference between taking what you want by force and earning what you deserve through skill, patience, and respect. These are the values that built this community, and these are the values that will preserve it." He turned to face Blackwood, who was nursing his bruises and his wounded pride. "Mr. Blackwood, I've completed my review of the land grant cases, and I'm ruling in favor of the original property owners. Your company's claims are without merit, and any further harassment of these families will result in federal prosecution." But Alejandro knew that legal victories, while important, were not enough to heal the divisions that had been created. Over the following weeks, he organized a series of workshops and demonstrations, teaching anyone who wanted to learn the traditional skills of the vaquero. Anglo ranchers learned rope techniques that had been perfected over centuries. German farmers discovered methods of horse training that were both more effective and more humane than what they had been using. Mexican-American vaqueros shared their knowledge freely, taking pride in their heritage while embracing their neighbors. The transformation was gradual but profound. The Esperanza Valley became known throughout Texas as a model of cooperation and mutual respect, a place where different cultures had learned to work together for the common good. Ranchers from across the state came to learn from Alejandro and his vaqueros, not just about horsemanship and cattle handling, but about building communities that were stronger because of their diversity. Blackwood and his company eventually left the valley, their schemes defeated not just by legal action, but by the unity of a community that had rediscovered its shared values. Some of his hired men, impressed by what they had witnessed, chose to stay and learn the vaquero way of life. Years later, when Alejandro was an old man, visitors would come to the Esperanza Valley to hear the story of the great Rodeo and the rope artist who had saved his community. They would find him on the porch of his adobe house, surrounded by grandchildren of many different backgrounds, all of them learning the skills and values that had been passed down through generations. Abuelo, one of his grandsons, would ask, "Tell us again about the day you roped the whole community together." Alejandro would smile and begin the story once more, but he would always end it the same way. "The rope was just a tool, mijo. What really brought people together was remembering that we all share the same land, the same sky, the same dreams for our children. That's the real magic, not what you can do with a rope, but what you can do when people work together with respect and understanding." The Rancho Esperanza still stands today, now operated by the fifth generation of the Vasquez family. The original adobe house has been preserved as a historical landmark, and the arena where Alejandro performed his legendary demonstration has become a pilgrimage site for horsemen from around the world. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the rope artist is not found in any building or monument, but in the community itself, a place where different cultures learned to celebrate their diversity while working together for the common good, where the wisdom of the past was preserved while embracing the possibilities of the future, and where one man's mastery of an ancient art became the foundation for a new way of living together in harmony. In the museum that now occupies part of the old ranch house, visitors can see Alejandro's original rayada, carefully preserved behind glass. But the real treasure is not the rope itself, but the story it represents. A reminder that the greatest victories are not won through force or intimidation, but through skill, patience, respect, and the courage to bring people together instead of driving them apart. The inscription on the museum's wall, written in both English and Spanish, captures the essence of Alejandro's legacy. Here lived a master who understood that the strongest rope is not made of rawhide or hemp, but of the bonds that connect one human heart to another. Here was proven that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from lifting them up and helping them discover their own potential. And in the valley that still bears the name Esperanza, hope, the descendants of vaqueros, farmers, ranchers, and dreamers continue to work together, bound not by the accident of birth or the color of their skin, but by their shared commitment to the land they love and the community they have built together, one generation at a time.